There is a single wall of concrete wedged into a canyon on the border between Nevada and Arizona that quietly holds the fate of the entire American Southwest. It is the Hoover Dam, and behind it sits Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States. For nearly a century, that dam and that lake have been the beating heart of a water system that keeps roughly 25 million people alive across some of the driest land in the country. And right now, that lake is dying, dropping toward a level where the dam can no longer do its job at all. But here is the part almost no one understands. If Hoover Dam dies, if Lake Mead falls to the point where the water can no longer pass through it, the 7 states that depend on the Colorado River do not all lose their water at the same moment. They do not go down together, evenly, holding hands. There is an order. A brutal, legally defined line that determines exactly who loses their water first, who loses it next, and who is protected until nearly the very end. That order was written almost 100 years ago, and most of the people whose lives depend on it have never heard of it. But when the crisis comes, that invisible pecking order will decide which cities and farms go dry first, and which get to keep drinking while their neighbors run out. So this is not just a story about a dam failing. It is a story about a countdown, a ranked list of victims, and the merciless rules that decide the sequence. 7 states drink from the same dying river, and when the water finally cannot reach them all, the question is not whether some of them lose, it is which ones lose first. And the answer will surprise you, because the states in the most immediate danger are not always the ones you would guess. Let me walk you through exactly what happens, and in what order, when the keystone of the West finally gives way. Stand at the top of Hoover Dam and look upstream at Lake Mead, and the scale of what is at stake is hard to take in. The water stretches back into the canyons, and rising out of it near the dam are the intake towers, the great structures that swallow the lake and feed it into the turbines and the pipes below. Years ago, those towers stood deep in the water, most of their height submerged. Today, a startling amount of them is exposed, dry concrete standing in the open air where there used to be hundreds of feet of water, a visible measure of how far the lake has fallen. Imagine standing on that dam and watching the water creep downward, foot by foot, year by year, toward the point where it slips below the lowest openings in those towers. The engineers who run the dam watch exactly that, tracking the elevation of the lake against the fixed elevations of the intakes and the outlets, numbers they know by heart, because those numbers are the countdown. Every foot the lake drops is a foot closer to the moment when the openings that let the water out are left high and dry, and the largest reservoir in the country becomes a lake that can no longer give anything to the people below it. That is the quiet drama playing out at the dam right now. Not a crack in the concrete, but a falling line of water sliding toward a set of openings that, once abandoned, end everything. First, you have to understand what it actually means for Hoover Dam to die, because it does not mean the concrete cracks and bursts. Hoover Dam does not have to fail structurally to stop working. It can be standing, perfectly intact, and still be dead, because a dam is only useful if there is enough water behind it to pass through. And Lake Mead has been dropping for more than 2 decades. There are 2 thresholds that matter, 2 lines on the canyon wall that spell the end. The first is the level at which the dam can no longer generate electricity, when the water falls too low to spin the turbines, somewhere around 950 feet of elevation. The second, and the fatal one, is called dead pool, at roughly 895 feet. Dead pool is the level at which the water behind the dam sits below the outlets that let it flow downstream. Below that line, the water is trapped. It cannot pass the dam at all. The river, in effect, stops at the wall. And everything downstream, every city, every farm, every faucet that depends on the Colorado River water released from Lake Mead is cut off from the source. That is what it means for Hoover Dam to die. Not an explosion, a quiet, rising line of dead water that can no longer get past the concrete, stranding a river that 25 million people were counting on. To see how close this really is, you have to picture the lake as it looks today. Anyone who has driven out to Lake Mead has seen it, even if they did not understand what they were looking at. The bathtub ring, that stark white band of bleached rock ringing the shoreline, a mineral stain left on the canyon walls marking where the water used to be. That ring is now well over 100 feet tall in places. 100 feet of missing water, painted onto the rock like a high water mark on the side of a sinking ship. The marinas have had to be moved again and again, chasing the retreating shoreline. Islands have become peninsulas. Boat ramps end in cracked mud far from the water. And down near the dam, the great intake towers that pull the water through stand higher and higher out of the lake each year, like pillars being slowly revealed as the water they were built to draw from falls away beneath them. The lake has already fallen to the lowest levels since it was first filled in the 1930s. It has already crossed into the range where the federal government has had to declare official shortages and start cutting deliveries. The dam is not dying in some distant future. The dying has already begun, and the only question left is how far it goes and who it takes with it, and in what order. Now, to understand the order, you have to understand the strange, century-old set of rules that governs this river, because that is what decides everything. The Colorado River is not a free-for-all. Every drop of it is spoken for, divided up by a web of laws, court rulings, and treaties so complex it has its own name, the Law of the River. And at the center of it is an agreement signed in 1922, the Colorado River Compact, which split the river between two groups of states, the Upper Basin, the states high up where the river is born, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, and the Lower Basin, the states downstream that draw from Lake Mead and the big reservoirs, Arizona, Nevada, and California. 7 states in all, plus a share promised by treaty to Mexico at the very end of the river. The compact divided the water between the basins, and within each basin the individual states hold specific allocations. But here is the crucial part, the part that decides the order of who loses first. American water law in the West runs on a principle called prior appropriation, which means, in plain terms, first in time, first in right. Whoever established their claim to the water earliest holds the most senior right and gets their full share before anyone with a junior, later claim gets a single drop. When there is not enough water, you do not cut everyone equally. You cut the most junior rights first, completely, before the senior rights lose anything. That principle, first in time, first in right, is the guillotine, and it has already decided the order of execution. Which brings us to the state first in line to lose its water, and it is the one that got the rawest deal in the entire system. Arizona. Arizona is the state that loses first, and it loses hardest, and the reason is a bargain it made decades ago that looks like a catastrophe today. Much of Arizona's Colorado River water is delivered through a massive canal system called the Central Arizona Project, which carries water hundreds of miles across the desert to Phoenix, to Tucson, and to the farms in between. But to get the federal government to build that canal back in the 1960s, Arizona had to agree to something fateful. It accepted a junior priority for that water. In exchange for the canal, Arizona agreed that, in a shortage, its Central Arizona Project water would be cut before California lost a drop. At the time, with the reservoirs full, it seemed like a fine trade. Today, it is the reason Arizona is first to the chopping block. When the shortages came, it was Arizona that took the first and deepest cuts, and the very first people to lose were the farmers of Pinal County, between Phoenix and Tucson, whose central Arizona project water was slashed and then largely cut off, forcing them to follow their fields and race to pump groundwater instead. As the dam dies and the cuts deepen, that junior priority means Arizona keeps losing, moving up the chain from the farms toward the cities, toward the taps of one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the country. Phoenix, a giant modern city in the desert, sits at the wrong end of a 100-year-old bargain. And when the water runs short, Arizona is the state the rules sacrifice first. And Arizona's fallback is failing at the same time, which is what makes its position so precarious. When the river water was cut, farmers and cities turned to groundwater, pumping from aquifers beneath the desert. But that groundwater is itself being mined faster than it can recharge, drawn down for so long that the ground in places has cracked into fissures, and the state has had to admit there is not enough of it to support all the growth already planned around Phoenix. So Arizona is losing its surface water first by law and running down its underground backup at the same time. Squeezed from above and below at once, the state most exposed in the entire system, precisely because both of its lifelines are failing together, and the rules guarantee the river is taken from it before anyone else. The second state to lose is small, and it is known it was in danger longer than anyone, which is the only reason it has survived this long. Nevada holds the smallest share of the Colorado River of any of the 7 states, a tiny allocation set back when almost no one lived there and no one imagined what Las Vegas would become. And today, that desert metropolis of more than 2 million people draws almost all of its water, something like 90% of it, from Lake Mead, the very reservoir that is dying. On paper, Nevada should already be finished. Its allocation is so small and its dependence so total. The only reason it is not is that Nevada saw this coming and acted with a desperation that borders on genius. It tore out lawns and banned ornamental grass by law. It recycles nearly all of its indoor water. And most dramatically, it spent well over $1 billion to drill a new intake tunnel deep beneath Lake Mead, a so-called third straw, reaching down to the very bottom of the reservoir, along with a pumping station able to pull water even as the lake approaches dead pool. Nevada essentially built itself a way to keep sipping from the glass right down to the final drops. But there is a limit to how clever you can be. As the lake falls toward dead pool, even the deepest straw runs out of water to reach, and Nevada, with the smallest cushion of all and near total dependence on a single dying lake, remains one of the most exposed places in the entire system. It has bought itself time. It has not bought itself an escape. The third state to lose is the giant of them all, and it is protected the longest, but the stakes when it finally falls are almost beyond imagining. California. California holds the most senior and the largest rights on the lower Colorado, which means that under the rules, first in time, first in right, it is protected until nearly the very end. Arizona and Nevada absorb their cuts first, in full, before California loses a major share. But do not mistake being last in the lower basin for being safe, because what California does with that water is stagger the mind. At the southeastern corner of the state sits the Imperial Valley, holding some of the oldest and most senior water rights on the entire river, and using them to grow an enormous share of the nation's winter vegetables, the lettuce and greens on tables across the country in the cold months, in what is otherwise a blistering desert. And the same Colorado River water, carried across the desert in a great aqueduct, helps supply the taps of roughly 19 million people in the Los Angeles and San Diego region. So, while California loses its river water last among the lower basin states, when the dam truly dies and the cuts climb high enough to reach even the most senior rights, What is at stake is the winter food supply of the whole country and the drinking water of one of the largest population centers on Earth. California is protected the longest precisely because what it holds is too big and too old and too senior to cut early. But last is not never. If Hoover Dam reaches dead pool, even California's ancient rights mean nothing, because there is no water left behind the wall to honor them with. And now the crisis climbs upstream to the 4 states that thought their position at the top of the river made them safe. The Upper Basin. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico sit high up where the Colorado and its tributaries are born, above Hoover Dam, above Lake Mead. And you might think that makes them immune to the dam dying downstream. It does not, and here is the twist that catches everyone. Under the compact, the Upper Basin is legally obligated to deliver a certain amount of water downstream to the Lower Basin every year. It is a promise written into that 1922 agreement, and it does not care about drought. So when the system reaches crisis, when there is not enough water to fill Lake Mead and keep Hoover Dam alive, the Lower Basin can, in effect, demand that the Upper Basin send its water down, a legal action known as a compact call. Something long feared and never fully tested. If that happens, the Upper Basin states could be forced to cut their own use, their own farms and towns, to send water downstream to satisfy a century-old promise, even in the middle of their own shortages. And the Upper Basin has its own dying reservoir, Lake Powell, held back by Glen Canyon Dam, which faces the exact same threat of falling too low to generate power or pass water. So the 4 upstream states are not spectators to the dam dying below them. They are bound to it, legally chained to a promise that could force them to drain their own supplies to feed the crisis downstream, all 7 states lashed together on the same sinking river, discovering that being upstream was never the protection they assumed. And at the very end of the line, past all 7 states, lies the final victim, the one that has already been sacrificed almost completely. Mexico. By a treaty signed in 1944, Mexico is promised a share of the Colorado River as it crosses the border, water that irrigates the farms of the Mexicali Valley and supplies cities like Tijuana. But Mexico sits at the absolute tail of the river, downstream of every American state, which means it is the last to be served and the first to be shorted when the system fails. And you can already see the end point of this entire crisis written into the land there, because the Colorado River no longer reaches the sea. A river that for millions of years carved the Grand Canyon and poured into the Gulf of California now runs dry in the desert of northern Mexico, its final stretch a cracked bed of sand and dust, the once vast green delta where it met the ocean reduced to a salt flat. That dead delta is the preview of what dead pool means. Made visible. It is what happens when every upstream user takes their share and there is simply nothing left at the bottom. The river already dies before it reaches the sea. The only question the dam's death raises is how far back up the line that dying creeps, and how many of the 7 states find themselves, one day, standing where Mexico already stands, at the dry end of a river that used to always arrive. So that is the order. Arizona first, then Nevada, then California, with the 4 Upper Basin states dragged in through the obligations of the compact, and Mexico at the very tail end of the river, losing its treaty share as the whole system fails. But the loss of drinking and irrigation water is only the first wave of the disaster, because Hoover Dam does more than hold water. Hoover Dam is also a power plant, and a massive one, and when the lake falls too low to spin its turbines, the lights go out for millions of people who never think about where their electricity comes from. The dam generates enormous amounts of hydroelectric power, clean and cheap, distributed across Nevada, Arizona, and California to cities, to rural utilities, to the pumps that move water through the system itself. And that is the cruel feedback loop hiding inside the crisis. Some of the electricity the dam produces is used to pump water through the very canals and aqueducts that carry Colorado River water across the desert. So as the lake falls and the power output weakens and then stops, you lose not only the water, but the energy needed to move whatever water is left, a system starving itself from two directions at once. The death of the dam is not just a water crisis, it is a simultaneous power crisis, striking the same region at the same time in the middle of a desert summer when the demand for electricity to run air conditioning is at its absolute peak. The dam that made modern life in the Southwest possible takes both the water and the power with it when it goes. And then comes the wave that reaches the entire country, far beyond the 7 states, through the food supply. The farms that draw on the lower Colorado, in Arizona, and in California's Imperial and Yuma valleys grow a staggering share of the vegetables that the whole nation eats, especially in winter. When people in cold northern cities buy fresh lettuce and greens in January, an enormous portion of it was grown in that desert with Colorado River water. So when the dam dies and those farms lose their water, the consequences do not stay in the Southwest. They travel up every grocery supply chain in the country. As the winter vegetable supply collapses and prices spike and shelves thin, and suddenly a family 2,000 miles away, who has never heard of Lake Mead and could not find Hoover Dam on a map, is paying the price of a dam they did not know their dinner depended on. This is why the death of one dam in one canyon is a national event and not a regional one. The water it holds does not just fill glasses in Phoenix and Las Vegas. It grows the food for a continent. And it lights the homes of millions. And when it fails all of that at once. And it is worth holding the sheer scale of it in your mind for a moment, because numbers this large stop feeling real. The Colorado River system supports something like 40 million people across its 7 states and Mexico when you count everyone who touches it, with roughly 25 million depending directly on the water passing through Lake Mead. It irrigates millions of acres of farmland. It underpins the economies of some of the fastest-growing cities in the nation, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and the sprawling metropolis of Southern California. Places that have added millions of residents in the very decades the river was declining. Trillions of dollars of economic activity, entire industries, the homes and jobs and futures of a huge slice of the American population, all balanced on a river that was overpromised from the start and a reservoir that is running dry. This is not a remote resource serving a few desert towns. It is one of the load-bearing pillars of the entire American economy, and it is cracking, and the number of people whose ordinary lives quietly depend on that one wall of concrete holding back that one shrinking lake is almost impossible to overstate. So let me show you what the day it actually happens would look like. Not as a chart, but as a lived event, because it would not feel like a slow statistic to the people in its path. Picture the summer the lake finally slides below the last outlet. Downstream, the flow in the canals and the aqueducts that carry Colorado River water begins to drop, and then to stop. In central Arizona, the great canal that feeds Phoenix and Tucson runs low, and a city of millions in the desert, already stripped of its farm water years earlier, faces cuts reaching its own homes. In Las Vegas, the billion-dollar straw strains at the bottom of a lake that barely covers it. In Southern California, the aqueduct that helps water 19 million people slows to a trickle, and the Imperial Valley, the winter garden of the nation, has its lifeblood pinched off in the middle of a growing season. At the dam itself, the turbines that lit millions of homes fall silent, in the peak of a desert summer when the air conditioning those homes depend on is running flat out. All of it happening at once, across a region the size of several countries in the same weeks, because the single wall of concrete that balanced the whole system finally could not hold enough water behind it to reach any of them. It would not be 7 separate local news stories. It would be one continental emergency, and it would arrive not over centuries, but over a single brutal stretch of months, once the line was finally crossed. So how real is this, actually? Is the dam truly at risk of dying, or is this just a frightening story? It is real, and the reason is a mistake baked into the system from the very beginning. When the Colorado River was divided up in 1922, the men doing the dividing measured the river during an unusually wet stretch, and they split up more water than the river actually carries in a normal year, let alone a dry one. The entire legal structure of the law of the river is built on water that does not exist. For decades, the enormous reservoirs of Lake Mead and Lake Powell hid this overallocation, acting as giant savings accounts that could be drawn down in dry years. But a punishing, multi-decade drought, deepened by a warming climate, has drained those savings accounts toward empty. And the fundamental arithmetic that more water is promised than the river provides can no longer be hidden. The lakes have fallen year after year toward the critical thresholds, and the federal government has been forced, for the first time in history, to declare shortages and impose cuts on Arizona, Nevada, and California, with deeper cuts proposed as the crisis worsens. Dead pool is not a fantasy scenario invented to scare people. It is a specific elevation on a chart that the water level has been sliding toward for 20 straight years, and every dry year brings it closer. The dam dying is not a question of if under the current trajectory. It is a question of when, and of whether anything can be done in time to stop it. And people always ask, why not just build our way out of it with desalination plants or pipelines or new technology? The answer is that every proposed fix is far too small for the size of the hole. Desalination, turning seawater into fresh, is enormously expensive and energy-hungry, and even a major plant produces a tiny fraction of what the Colorado River delivers. Nowhere near enough to replace a river that supplies 25 million people and millions of acres of farmland. The dream of piping water in from the Mississippi or the Great Lakes, floated again and again, collapses under the cost, the distance, the mountains in the way, and the fierce refusal of those other regions to give up their own water. Recycling and conservation are real and worth doing, and cities like Las Vegas have pushed them further than almost anyone thought possible. But they can only stretch the existing supply, not create a new river. Cloud seeding, squeezing a little extra snow from passing storms, adds a rounding error at best. The brutal truth is that there is no technology on the shelf. At any price the region could plausibly pay, that refills the gap between what the river promises and what it delivers. The water that built the Southwest was a one-time gift of a big river and 2 giant reservoirs. And once those reservoirs are drawn down, nothing we can build puts the river back. The fixes buy time and trim the edges. None of them save the dam. And that brings us to the final, maddening piece, which is why it is so hard to stop, even now that everyone can see it coming. The 7 states have known about this for years. They have held negotiation after negotiation, trying to agree on who will cut how much to keep the system alive. And they cannot agree, because every state is fighting to protect its own share, and no state wants to be the one that volunteers to take a deeper cut so its neighbors can keep more. The same first in time, first in right rules that set the order of who loses also give the senior states every incentive to protect their seniority and force the juniors to bleed first. The upper basin and the lower basin blame each other. The farms and the cities blame each other, and in over 100 years of sharing this river, not one of the 7 has ever willingly gone first in giving up water. So the negotiations grind on while the lake keeps dropping, each state calculating that it is better to fight for its full share and risk the whole system than to sacrifice voluntarily and watch a neighbor benefit. It is a slow-motion game of chicken with 25 million people's water as the stake, and the dam does not wait for the lawyers. Every month, they argue, the white ring on the canyon wall climbs a little higher, and the dead water behind the concrete creeps a little closer to the line where it can no longer get out. Stand at Hoover Dam today, and it looks eternal. That vast curve of concrete that turned the desert into a civilization, and it is almost impossible to believe that something so mighty could simply stop working, that the water could ever fail to reach the people who built their whole world around it. But the bathtub ring keeps climbing. The intake towers rise higher out of the falling lake each year. The river is still promised to more people than it can serve, and not one of the 7 states will be the first to give up its share. Arizona is already taking the cuts, its farms already going dry. First in line, as the century-old rules always said it would be. Nevada sips from the bottom of the glass through its billion-dollar straw. California guards its senior rights and the nation's winter food behind them. And the 4 upstream states wait, legally chained to a promise that could drain them too. If Hoover Dam dies, they do not fall together. They fall in order, one after another, exactly as a piece of paper signed in 1922 decreed. And the only thing still undecided is how far down the list the water level drops before the country finally admits that the river it built the West on was never big enough to keep it alive, and the wall of concrete in the canyon, still standing, still perfect, holds nothing back but a dead pool that can no longer reach a single thirsty state.